Perhaps not surprisingly, this is a topic close to my heart: education, 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 as Tony Blair famously put it. And actually, the photograph I've put up there, you may think, what on earth is that photograph of those old gadgets? It's actually of the opening of Bird Mill Comprehensive School in Essex, in Harlow, in 1962. You've guessed, that was my school. I would go there 9 years later. The guy on the front, sort of fourth from the left, is Ray Sterling. He was my headmaster. Standing at the back is Mr. Gosman. He was my second headmaster there. Also, towards the back on the other side is Finley Fraser Jock, as he was known to everybody, who was my housemaster. And that brings me to what I want to talk about, which is education in the 50s. Well, actually, we need to start to go back well before the 50s. We need to go back to the Butler Act of 1944, and actually before that to the Haddo Report of 1926. We ought to like Sir Henry Haddo, because he was at one time the principal of Armstrong College, which became Newcastle University. He was then Vice-Chancellor of Durham University, and across both of those periods, he was actually a governor of the RGS. In 1926, he published the Haddo Report, which made a recommendation to reform the British education system. It took until 1944 for those reforms to be implemented. The Butler Act envisaged a new system of education in Britain, a tripartite system: grammar schools for the most able, 20% or so, technical schools for those who are going to be the technical whizzers, and modern schools for everybody else. The Butler Act is really important. It creates secondary education, proper secondary education for all British children for the first time, or English or Welsh children to be exact, because Scotland and Northern Ireland had separate education systems, but for the first time in our history. In that sense, we're all children of the Butler Act. It also initiated, by the way, thanks to Ellen Wilkinson, George Tomlinson, and then the Conservatives in the 50s, a great wave of school building, hence Burt Mill opening in 1962. There were, however, limitations to the Butler settlement, and this became the big issue in the 50s. The problem was that the grammar schools, worked fine, okay? They worked very well. And the cliche of the grammar school boy or girl on the rise, Ted Heath, Margaret Thatcher, Harold Wilson, is one of the cliches of the period. Grammar school boys making their way into universities, into national life. It's absolutely a cliche of this period. It's a little bit misleading. Most children in grammar schools were actually middle class. They weren't working class. Yes, some of them were lower middle class, to Ted Heath, Harold Wilson's, Margaret Thatcher, perhaps less so, but certainly Ted Heath and Harold Wilson. But less of them were actually working class. Part of the problem for this was the selection process into grammar school. The idea was that the grammar school exam, the 11 plus exam that you took in your primary school, was somehow blind. This is the great one we're always aiming for, one that isn't coachable. Nah, wasn't true at all. It was very eminently coachable. When I took the 11 plus in 1971, was it 70 or 71? Some of the middle class kids in my village school had definitely been coached to do this exam. They didn't pass it, by the way. The second factor about it was class. There were class barriers to going to grammar school. Money, uniform, all the equipment, not feeling part of it. Oh, it's not our sort. That sort of people don't go to grammar school. That's why I didn't go. My dad was dead set against me going to grammar school, said I'd become a toff. There were other barriers to do with class as well, just not fitting in. Then there were class barriers within grammar schools. Grammar schools in those days were what we call streamed. You tended to have the A team, the B team, the C team, the A stream, the B stream, the C stream. And if you got stuck in the C stream, you weren't going to go very far, very fast, to be frank with you. Then there were technical schools. Well, there weren't. Because probably technical schools, they were expensive. Ask any school bursar or any university vice-chancellor and say, what's the expensive bit of the education you provide? And they'll tell you, it's all the science, engineering, medicine, and that sort of stuff, because you shed loads of kit. Us historians are dirt cheap. Okay, and the problem was that technical schools were going to be expensive, and so they just never got built, or very few did. The idea had been that there would be parity of esteem between the secondary mods and the grammars. No, never happened. Grammar schools got the lion's share of resources, they got the best teachers by and large. And that meant the secondary moderns ended up as a kind of secondary sump, if you like. I reckon there's only one good Ken Loach film personally, it's Kes. And in Kes, young Billy Casper has seen a glimpse of what life could be like. He trains this kestrel. He sees a glimpse of life beyond his pit and his pit village and his dismal, boring working class life he's condemned to. He ends up going down the pit, of course. His careers master says, you've got no alternative. If you go down, it was a careers master. It's just one chat. It says, you're going down the pit, and he ends up down the pit. The secondary modern system didn't deliver social mobility in the way it was hoped to. That was the belief. The solution was held to be comprehensive schools, multilaterals they were called originally, but comprehensive schools in which all children would go to the same school. And the idea of this was that it would give, therefore, equality of opportunity. There's all kind of problems with that, by the way. I went to a comprehensive school, and I'm not sure it did offer complete equality at all. By the stage we got to O-level, for example, the small percentage of us doing O-levels, about a fifth of the school, were almost totally separate from the rest of them. The vast majority left school at 16 anyway, so the few of us that stayed on were now completely separate and different from everybody else. Some comps, my comp was genuinely cross class, I think. There were middle class kids in the school, others weren't. The other problem was that local councils were often against them, in particular conservative local councils. This is a pretty simple reason. If your kid's in the grammar school, you like the grammar school. If your kids aren't in the grammar school, you don't. For the Conservatives in the shires, often their voters' children were in the grammar schools and they liked them and they had a kind of sentimental attachment to them, understandably, because they were often really good schools. And that's the part of it. They were often excellent schools. Labour were dead set against grammar schools. A famous Tony Croston quote, the rising star of Labour, he was going to shut every effing grammar school in the country, he famously once said. Except he didn't say effing. The Conservative Education Secretary of the later years of these governments, Edward Boyle, also favoured comprehensive schools. He thought they were a solution to the nation's education problems. The problem was, school provision was in the hands ultimately of local educational authorities. If the LEA stood out against comprehensives, they weren't going to happen. Interestingly, more comps are built in the years that follow under the Conservatives than Labour. And some of you may know, more comprehensive schools are created under Margaret Thatcher and more grammar schools shut than under any other education secretary, when she was education secretary in the early 70s. Then there's universities. Okay? Following Labour's reforms post-war and the expansion of red brick universities further, there are more children going to university now. So by 1950, it's about 3.5% of each cohort went into higher education. By 1970, that would be 8.4%. How did that happen? Well, it happens for various reasons. Red brick universities really seriously expanded, and university colleges across the country are converted into universities. And we have what are called the plate glass universities being built. Sussex is the first one coming in just at the end of the 60s. And then the Robbins report in 1963 recommended again an expansion, particularly of scientific higher education. So we do see in these years a move towards a substantial expansion of higher education that would lead ultimately, as I say, to about 8.5%. And then by the time I went, I think it was nearer, so it was well over 10. It also saw a great expansion in night classes. This was very important for a lot of working class people who were able to make their way up in the world. Had to leave school at 16, but they could go to night classes and they could get themselves an education and often get themselves a much better job. And I think these processes do see the beginning of this great outburst of post-war social mobility. Rab Butler in 1960 said, "We don't want a society anymore of the haves and have-nots." Well, we still had the society of the haves and have-nots, but some of the have-nots now had a chance to turn themselves into haves. And I think that's a really important reform. Yeah, there was still some way to go with education. There usually is in English history. But I think this is a period that did see a substantial change in the British education system.